All right, so in the remaining 35 minutes before lunchtime, or 25 minutes, whatever the number is, the piece that I want to talk about is, what is it? 12 minutes. Wow. Okay. The piece that I want to discuss, and I've already covered some of this in other conversations, is what are the specific nutrient interactions that you need to be cognizant of? There's hundreds of nutrient interactions. There's only a handful that really make a difference from a practical management perspective. So the first of these is calcium and potassium. Calcium and potassium actively antagonize each other. When you have an excess of one, it will automatically create a deficiency of the other. And this afternoon, I'll have more of a discussion about how this impacts fruit quality and how to manage fruit quality with this interaction, because what I can say is that 80% or more of all fruit quality problems are a direct result of mismanagement of these two nutrients and at different stages of development. So the question then becomes, how do you manage that calcium and potassium relationship, particularly since potassium is often the dominating factor, and you often tend to have excessive levels of potassium that create calcium deficiencies. The key to managing that goes back to the story that I shared about potassium absorption in tomato production in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. When we started putting on additional manganese, we discovered that manganese is the potassium thermostat, and it auto-regulates potassium. So this manganese-potassium relationship allows us to regulate potassium and allow calcium to move into the embryo and move into the fruit to have better fruit quality and suppress potassium translocation. Yes?
Sorry, I know you don't have a lot of time, but so if you have natural levels of potassium in your soil that are high
Yep.
and terrible bitter pit problems, so are you saying that if we manage our manganese, we can antagonize our potassium so that
Yes.
it's not taken up as much?
Yes. Two pieces that manganese will do. When you have excess, or when you bring manganese levels in the plant up to a generous point where there's a generous manganese supply, two things will happen. One is that it will suppress the absorption of potassium from the soil, but to the ideal point, it will moderate it. You will still have generous levels of potassium inside the plant, and the second piece that it will do is it will also moderate potassium flow into the fruit embryo. So it will allow calcium to it will selectively allow calcium to flow into the embryo rather than excessive levels of potassium.
Okay.
That's negating luxury consumption.
Yes.
That's what you say.
It's negating luxury consumption. It's a great way of putting it. I don't think I charged you guys enough to come here and share all our secrets, by the way. So, an additional critical nutrient interaction is zinc and phosphorus. So, zinc, the simplest way to describe this is that zinc is the thermostat for phosphorus, and phosphorus is the thermostat for zinc. An excess of one has the potential to create a deficiency of the other, and an excess of one can be dampened with the other. So earlier, I'm going to skip on here to calcium and boron. The exact same scenario holds true of calcium and boron. I described how if you have a boron excess, you can fix the problem with a foliar spray of calcium. If you have a calcium excess, you can fix the problem with a foliar spray of boron. And the opposite is also true when you have soils. Let's say you have soils that are high in calcium, but the plant isn't picking it up, you can fix it with a foliar spray of boron, and the plant will pick up more calcium. Or also the opposite, when you have soils that are high in boron, you can put on a foliar spray of calcium, the plants will pick it up. Again, we can make this sound really complicated, but these plants have some homeostatic regulatory capacity that we do not understand, that they will self-regulate and auto-regulate the nutrients in their desired values given the right supporting nutrition, given the right tools. It auto-balances all on its own. It's really a fascinating process. So what I'm describing about boron and calcium, the exact same also holds true for zinc and phosphorus. It's the same type of relationship, the same type of mechanism.
Let me ask you something on that boron. Now, boron's got a narrow range. 20 part per million below that is usually deficient, and greater than 200 part per million will kill almost any plant.
That's a 10x variable. I'd call that a fairly broad range.
Okay, but it's still micro max. But anyway, what do you see as right in a plant, in most plants that you work with?
It can vary substantially. There are some crops, such as one crop on one end of the spectrum would be citrus, for example, which citrus are a cation hyperaccumulator. They desire very high levels of calcium, and they also have associated very high requirements for boron. Strawberries are on the opposite end of the spectrum. Strawberries have extremely low requirements for boron. So we actually, as a part of the handout that we'll be talking about this afternoon, we've gone through the exercise of looking at all of our data over the past several years on sap analysis and defining desired values. So there is one sheet in the handout that has some of those for some tree fruit crops, but we also have similar sheets for berry crops and for forages, and we have half a dozen sheets like that for different crops. That should be available on the Crop Health Lab's website. So the answer is it can vary substantially from crop to crop. All right, additional critical nutrient interaction. This is probably, for those of you who are in California and parts of the world where we have high sodium irrigation water, you'll see this most commonly. When you have high levels of sodium, you'll see both potassium and calcium levels drop because sodium is so readily absorbed, so readily available, the plants will pick it up preferentially before they will pick up either potassium or calcium. And when discussing nitrates, I described this relationship briefly. Chlorides and nitrates very strongly antagonize each other. When you have irrigation water that has high levels of chlorides, it'll suppress the nitrate absorption. And particularly also for disease management, insect management, when the chloride levels exceed total nitrogen, you start seeing major problems with disease susceptibility. Nitrate has a direct inverse correlation with this trio of magnesium, sulfur, and molybdenum. We find that when we supply adequate levels of those three nutrients, we see the nitrate levels go down to a non-detect very quickly. So there is a select group of specific nutrients that we need to emphasize very strongly for disease resistance, if disease resistance is our objective. Number one is manganese. Manganese deficiencies are associated with many, many different diseases. More than I'm even going to try to describe. Low phosphorus levels are often also associated with a variety of different diseases. And I've described this chloride-nitrogen interaction when, and specifically on the sap analysis, I'm referring to total nitrogen, not nitrate, not ammonium. But when chloride levels increase to be higher than the total nitrogen, the susceptibility to aphids and whiteflies and these insects with very simple digestive systems just accelerates. You can almost guarantee that they're going to be there. They come in very, very quickly. I described the process with high ammonium. Actually, let me go back here. So with nitrates, whenever we have high levels of nitrates, the insects that we see happening are being present would be aphids and all of the Hemidoptera, Lepidoptera, the various larval insects, corn earworm, European corn borer, cabbage looper, tomato hornworm, and so forth, will show up when we have high levels of nitrates. When we have high levels of ammonium, we see that we have very high infestation of a lot of the insects such as spider mites. Basically anything that is associated with a very warm environment, high ammonium concentrations, is also associated with high ammonium concentrations, When we have that sugar accumulation that I talked about, when we have boron deficiencies or phosphorus deficiencies or pesticide applications, you're going to really trigger insect and disease susceptibility very aggressively. So I got through that in less than 12 minutes, I think. I got 3 minutes to spare. It's pretty good. Yes?
So on the last point, it's always talked about that high sugar levels are a positive thing. Now,
Yep.
what's that different than what you just said?
Specifically, I'm referring to high levels of soluble sugars in the plant sap. So every 24 hours, we need all those sugars to be metabolized and processed. In other words, we do not want any monosaccharides to be present in the plant sap. We want all of those sugars to be converted to oligosaccharides, polysaccharides, compounds such as cellulose, hemicellulose, lignans, pectins, and so forth. So we want all that sugar to be metabolized. If it isn't metabolized, it stays in the plant sap as very soluble sugar that is the food source for all these diseases and all these insects. That's what they're dependent on as an energy source. And the interesting part is, if you really want to think about this, this is essentially how herbicides kill plants. This is how glyphosate, this is how Roundup kills plants. Roundup doesn't kill plants. You can spray a plant that has been planted into sterile soil with Roundup, and you'll stunt it, but it won't kill it. Why? Because the only thing that Roundup does, and the majority of herbicides actually, is that it's simply a very strong chelation agent, and it binds specific trace minerals. In other words, it shuts off certain parts of the plant's metabolic pathway because it shut down the enzyme cofactors, and now the plant produces this the plant becomes really sick and has these extremely high concentrations of soluble sugars in the plant sap, which is the perfect food source for, in the case of Roundup, particularly Fusarium, because glyphosate also, as it's sent out through the root system, destroys all of the what are referred to as the facultative anaerobes, or the reducing bacterial organisms, and it creates an environment in which Fusarium can proliferate. So Fusarium begins feeding on the soluble sugars in the root system, and Fusarium is actually what kills the plant. Roundup doesn't kill plants, Fusarium kills plants. So all of this discussion about producing Roundup-resistant weeds, we haven't bred these weeds to be resistant to Roundup, they're simply resistant to Fusarium. We've been breeding Fusarium-resistant crops for a very long time. It's not that complicated. It's the essence of how it works. All right, so thank you for your attention this morning, and I think I'm going to turn it over. We're going to take a break for lunch. Nap, sit back, relax, see if you can go to sleep now. All right, so in the discussions this morning, I've tried to kind of give an overview of the different, what are all the different puzzle pieces? What are the pieces that go into the puzzle? What does the puzzle look like? What's the picture look like? And now, so what we've had up to this point is just simply an informative conversation. Now we actually have to turn it into practical application. How do we use all of this information to make recommendations? And so in this next discussion, I'd really like to talk about how we make recommendations, how we interpret the results that we get back, and then following that, we're going to have a discussion where we're going to review a number of different SAP analysis reports, and we're going to go through the exercise of actually making recommendations, and we'll just have an open, informal question and answer session and review all of the questions that you guys might have. So, one of the points that I made earlier today, and that I just cannot overemphasize, is that in order for plants have the potential to be completely resistant to disease and insect pests. They have the potential to produce higher yields and higher quality yields than what most people have imagined to be possible. If you think about the tremendous number of blossoms that a cherry tree or an apple tree or a pear tree sets and pollinates, but then later drops as a fruit drop, that is simply an expression of that plant telling us it has the inherent genetic potential to produce that level of yield and that level of volume. But it is simply being limited by the nutritional supply and the support system to be able to produce fruit to that degree. So we see consistently when in our consulting work at Advancing Eco-Agriculture, when we start working with SAP analysis, when we start working with farms very closely, on about 40% of the operations that we work with, we expect to see a substantial yield increase. And by substantial, I'm not talking about 5% or 10%. I'm talking about 15, 20%, 30%, sometimes even greater yield increases that happen on some of these operations. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen on all the operations that we're working with. There's a variety of different characteristics that need to all come together to make this happen. But when a farm is being managed very well, and we have 10 to 20% good soil to work with, and we start working with sap analysis, we're able to get a tremendous crop response by tailoring and customizing nutrition. In order to do that, in order to deliver those level of results, you must have consistent nutrient supply throughout the growing season. And so when we're working with high-value crops like cherries or wine grapes or apples or strawberries, whatever the case might be, we're looking at consistent foliar applications every 2 weeks throughout the entire growing season, sap analysis every 2 weeks throughout the entire growing season, and if we're irrigating, consistent nutrient applications in the fertigation system throughout the entire growing season. That's when you fine-tune it and tailor it to that degree, that's the only way you can get to those much higher plateaus of performance. Yes?
What's the time frame for those results?
The first year.
1 year?
1 year.
Okay.
The first year. Yep. So,
John,
yep.
when you look at being able to control most of these, where do you include the genetic issues, like the issue of some don't pick up silica, for example, the strawberry example that we looked at before?
Right. So, I mean, obviously, there is a genetic component to getting the results that we get. There is a management component, and there is also the the given conditions that you have to work with, geological soil conditions that you have to work with when you first start working with a farm. So on all the farms that we work with, we expect to see a substantial response the first year. But on some operations, it takes 2 to 3 years to get to really where we believe that we have the potential to be. So take tree fruit production. If you're working with trees that are 30 years old, it's going to take a lot more energy and a lot more resources, because essentially it would be a lot easier to work with a strawberry crop that's 1 year old. But in the case of the trees, you have to completely remineralize the entire trunk and branches and all the living tissue on the outside of that tree before you can start having a tremendous impact on the next crop. So it takes a lot more material to have the response that we're looking for. And then, of course, there's also the genetic component, which is that some varieties will do a much better job of absorbing nutrients. Some varieties have much lower nutritional requirements. Take strawberries, for example. When we talk about varieties having genetic differences in nutritional requirements, I'm not talking about the differences between having a phosphorus requirement of 300 versus 400 parts per million, or nitrogen of 600 versus 800 parts per million. In California strawberry production, there are some varieties of strawberries that have desired values of nitrogen of 1900 to 2500 parts per million, and others that you will kill with anything above 700. So you're talking about a 3 times difference in nitrogen demand by a strawberry plant, simply from different genetics. It's a huge genetic difference. And there are, I mean, it's basically, and those genetic differences are coming from one of the breeders that we're working with. I mean, another interesting aspect is that sap analysis is now actually being used as a breeding tool to identify specific varieties, because they're finding that there are correlations between specific mineral profiles and very strong and aggressive root systems. And they're selecting for very strong aggressive root systems. So there are one of the breeders that we're working with, their strawberry varieties have very low nitrogen requirements. They require only a third of the nitrogen requirements as the varieties that were developed by the universities. So the land-grant university varieties have much greater nitrogen and phosphorus requirements than the private varieties do. So it is impossible for me to give you precise recommendations and say that when we have manganese level at this amount and our desired value is this amount, we need to put on X quantity. It isn't possible for me to do that and to give you those numbers, because there are so many different factors that influence what is happening in the field. There are, whoops, that was not the intention. You have different stages of plant development, different levels of nutritional requirements. You have different amounts of plant biomass and crop biomass. You wouldn't put the same amount of manganese application out there on a tomato plant that is 10 inches tall versus a tomato plant that is 4 feet tall. There are different application rates are required. So there's a number of different things that tie into nutrient application. So I can't give you all those details. What I can try to do is kind of give you the general outline of how we approach it and how we make recommendations. And a lot of it is going to come from experience. With a little bit of experience, all of a sudden things start making a lot of sense very quickly. So the first piece, you get a SAP analysis report back. All of you should have this handout with the SAP analysis report on it. Rob is going to, after this discussion, we're going to go through some of these analyses. But you get this piece of paper back from the laboratory. You look at it, and now the question is, what are you going to do with this information? Which nutrients are you going to apply first? There is usually, the usual expectation is that the first thing to do is to address all of the deficiencies. If you have a deficiency of manganese, you need to put on more manganese. If you have a deficiency of boron, you need to put on more boron. And I want you guys to change that. The first priority is not to apply the to address the deficiencies. The first priority is to put on the antidote for all of the excesses. Remember, it's the excesses that are, in all likelihood, creating some of our deficiencies. So that is the first thing to address. When you have an excess of one of these elements, the first thing to address is to address the antidote. Actually, let me back up just one step further. Foliar sprays have 4 purposes. The first is to increase a plant's photosynthetic potential, photosynthetic capacity every 24 hours. The second is to increase a plant's photosynthesis. And the third is to increase the plant's photosynthesis. And the fourth, and only the fourth, can you start paying attention to trying to balance mineral nutrition, either excesses or deficiencies. You have to emphasize and focus on photosynthesis, photosynthesis, photosynthesis. And so there are a handful of elements that I discussed that are directly associated with the photosynthetic process: nitrogen, magnesium, iron, manganese, phosphorus. Those elements, if they are not in generous supply on a SAP analysis, have to be addressed. That is number one priority. We have to bring the photosynthetic efficiency up to a higher plateau of performance. And then also sulfur for the photosynthesis or protein synthesis aspect as well, although it's not as involved directly with photosynthesis. Once we've addressed photosynthesis, then we can look at these nutritional priorities from the SAP results. The first piece to look at is to provide the antidote for all the excesses. And I described what those would be in the earlier discussions. Then secondly, once you've addressed all the antidotes for the excesses, at the second point, now you can look at all the various deficiencies and address all the different nutrients that are actually deficient. And in some cases, there's going to be a substantial amount of overlap. The antidotes are the ones that are needed to address deficiencies anyhow. So the second point, the second part of determining application rates is thinking about how much this plant is going to require. So the interesting part is that the desired values, we have the one piece of paper that we circulated, and we have additional desired values available as well if you want to look at those. But if you have a strawberry plant that has a desired value of 700 parts per million nitrogen, that number, that desired value of 700 parts per million, holds true from the first day that plant is in the ground until you're done harvesting. However, it takes a very, very different amount of nitrogen to keep that number stable at 700 at different stages of plant development. So the amount of nitrogen that needs to be supplied to maintain that level at some seasons, at some stages of development, is much higher than at others. Another example would be potassium on tomatoes. The desired value for potassium on a given variety of tomatoes like Mountain Fresh might be 3,200 parts per million. But in the first 8 weeks of plant development, it takes a couple of pounds of potassium per acre per week, or maybe none at all if the soil has adequate levels of potassium, to maintain 3,200 parts per million. Once you get to the fruit fill stage, all of a sudden you may need to apply 15 pounds of potassium per acre per week to maintain 3,200 parts per million. So the desired value remains constant. The desired value doesn't actually change, but the amount of nutrients required to meet that desired value is definitely going to fluctuate based on different stages of plant development throughout the growing season. Any of you guys have any questions on this concept? All clear? Either you're taking a nap or not thinking, or you've got it all figured out, in which case this discussion is going to be very short.
I'll throw something in. Say take cotton, for instance. When it first blooms, for about the first 4 weeks, the uptake of K is about 3 pounds per day. Something like it. It's a pretty high call for it. But once you get the sink or the bowl formation, then in the leaf, looking at a nutrient standpoint, the critical level starts to really fall, and it'll fall from there till it matures. So, but there's a point where the sink is where most of the nutrient is. The potash is there for turgor pressure to form the fiber, and that's where. So I don't know if your sap measurements, if you just measure the leaves instead of the sink, you're going to get different values. Elaborate on some of that for me, because it's going to change as the plant. These nutrients are going to move in the plant.
Correct. Yes. So, one of the pieces that you raise a very, very good point, and in the Netherlands, where this technology was originally developed, they actually also analyze the fruit at the same time that they do a leaf analysis throughout the entire growing season. They're able to monitor how nutrient is moving into the fruit. Netherlands Customs Border Security really does not like us to ship fruit from the U.S. to the Netherlands for some strange reason that I just can't figure out. So we've not been able to do fruit analysis at this point until we have a laboratory here, which hopefully will happen very soon. With that being said, if I understood your comment correctly, what you're describing is that you actually are you seeing the desired values of nutrients in the leaves change and fluctuate? Or
The desired value, what you would say is adequate.
right.
It's on each week of bloom, it gets to be a little bit less.
Right.
Is the reality of it. So it doesn't. The critical level is not as high as the week before.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is that nutrient is being translocated to the sink, and that's where it's accumulating.
So, see, you just used a very interesting choice of words, which was the critical value. What's the critical value? And I'm assuming that that is a number that has been put together over a lot of experience to optimize yield. So now I would ask the question, what happens when you change the frame? And instead of focusing on optimizing yield, your focus is on optimizing quality and plant health. Does that desired value now change where it remains flatline? That has been our experience, is that yes, you can have the nutrient levels drop off as you're filling fruit without having a significant impact on yield. But what if you want to achieve disease resistance at the same time and have a higher quality yield? You can do that by maintaining that nutrient line at a flat line, a constant line all the way through.
Gotcha. That's the sap. By taking just the leaf, you can monitor that.
Yes. Yep.
Sean,
Yes.
do you know if there's any correlation between plant health and frost tolerance?
So the question was, do we know if there's any correlation between plant health and frost tolerance? And yes, there is, substantial. There has been a lot of discussion and a lot of claims made to that effect over the years, that nutrition can have an impact on freezing resistance, frost resistance. And We have observed some limited effect, but it was very difficult to quantify. And we do now have, in the last 3 years since we started using SAP analysis, we've been able to quantify it much more accurately, much more consistently, see exactly what is happening and what's going on. There seem to be at least 2 mechanisms, possibly more. But the one mechanism is that when you have sap that has a higher concentration of the correct sugars, not the soluble sugars that happen when you have pesticide applications and so forth, but when you have higher sap concentrations of the correct sugars, it reduces the freezing temperature by approximately 3 degrees Fahrenheit, to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you have very high Brix level, it can reduce the freezing temperature. Same thing that happens when you try to freeze ice cream and you put too much sugar in it. It doesn't want to freeze. Something similar happens with potassium. 97% of the potassium in a plant is in the plant sap. It's an electrolyte, very similar to sodium. It's very closely associated with sodium, and that also reduces the freezing temperature, and we seem to get an additional 3 degrees Fahrenheit advantage with generous levels of potassium in the plant sap. So the combination of those 2 pieces has led us to the maximum impact that we have had has been about 6 degrees Fahrenheit increased frost resistance. So what that translates to in actual experience, this in Oregon, I think it was November 2014, in Oregon, with some of the cherry production that we were working with, they went from 55, 60 degree temperatures, very nice balmy winter, late fall weather, to having 3 days of very high winds, ice storms, and sub-zero temperatures. Ended up completely, many growers ended up losing all of their buds, all their reproductive buds. They had to do very aggressive top working, very aggressive pruning on the top of the trees. They lost the majority of their crop, and many people lost trees. On the blocks that had been using the AEA foliar nutrition, not soil. They were not doing anything with soil. They were just starting to work with foliars and had been working with foliars for 2 years. They kept 82% of the buds versus 100% loss. So it's a substantial difference in very harsh conditions. So the next part, determining application rates. For the sake of the exercise that we want to go through, and also when you're out in the field, it is easiest to think in terms of application ranges. We need low amounts of manganese, we need medium, we need high amounts of manganese. It's much easier to do that than to think of, and for me to make recommendations for you need a pint or a quart or a pound or whatever. So look at the products that you're using, those products' application rates, and think of those product application rates in terms of the ranges that you're using, low, medium, and high. And then, when you actually go out into the field, with the beauty of SAP analysis and using SAP analysis as a monitoring tool throughout the growing season is that you have an initial test as a starting point, you apply product at a certain application rate, and then you test it again 2 weeks later and you see exactly what happened. And what this means is that there are going to be some fertilizer companies that will absolutely love SAP analysis and others that will not want their customers to use it. So, you can test very quickly whether you applied enough product. Did you get to the results that you were looking for? Are you where you need to be? Do you need to put more on? Can you wait until another 2 weeks for additional application? And with that, with a little amount of experience, it will not take long. You will very quickly get the feel for approximately how much product you need to apply to get a crop response. And it varies obviously from product to product. I'm not familiar with the product line that you guys are working with, but you will learn very quickly the approximate application rates that are going to be needed to trigger a certain amount of response. It's not rocket science. It's not that difficult to figure out. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions. We can talk about anything that it is that you want to talk about. We'll have an open Q&A for a few minutes, and then we're going to change to looking at some of these reports.
So the first question I have is, when you're talking about SAP testing, when, like, for apples, for example, when should we start making these, or taking the samples? Because I mean, we're getting like green tip out there. We're going to have bloom in 2 weeks, and so I mean.
So the correct answer in that case is today. But the so
But
I'd like to.
You need to have an old leaf and a new leaf, though, right?
We at the beginning of the season we will start with just a single leaf,
Oh,
and just a
okay.
single sample. We'll often do that for 2 sample periods, sometimes 3,
Okay.
and then we go to old and new. So Eric, would you like to describe what you have done with apples up to this point? And also, could just say that if you go onto the Crop Health Lab's website, they have very detailed sample collection instruction manuals for a variety of different crops, because it's different for peaches from apples to pears. There are some slight differences from crop to crop, and so they're very detailed with photos of exactly how to collect samples.
Sure. With apples, we've started with taking a single type of leaf, a spur leaf, the largest spur leaf that's fully developed, or at least mostly developed. In subsequent weeks, if there's not enough new growth, we'll take another spur leaf in 2 weeks, and then we'll take usually a third spur leaf and then a leaf developed on the new growth. And then at some point we'll transition to taking old new growth leaves and new growth leaves, because the spur leaves have kind of ceased functioning or stopped contributing to the nutrient
Talk about
prescription.
how you describe that first leaf. This should be an old leaf. Listed as an old leaf.
Oh, when you submit your first sample of a spur leaf, submit it as, use one of the old leaf labels. And the reason for that is when you go onto the Bemisting online program that the Netherlands has, your charts will track better if you submit it as an old leaf sample.
So they have a graphing tool that allows you to graph the nutrients, so it'll graph all the old leaves and all the new leaves on one line.
Right.
And so you can see how nutrients are flowing throughout the season over a period of time. So if you start with those first couple of samples and identify them as old, it'll track them with the other old leaves at the bottom of the graph for the rest of the season as well.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
very
handy
good.
for spotting trends.
Very, very handy. Yeah. All right. Yes.
If a person runs a perfect program, if that's possible, are you saying that we in the future may not have to spray for apple maggots, codling moth? We can eliminate.
I don't have enough experience with those 2 specific insects to say for certain, but on other crops, with cherries, for example, we have been able to almost completely eliminate fungicide and insecticide applications. Strawberries, we've been very successful in accomplishing those results. Tomatoes, a number of different crops. So I believe that, yes, it is possible, in our experience, for crops to be completely resistant to diseases and insects. And I mean, if you can successfully produce crops that are resistant to Colorado potato beetle and Japanese beetle and cucumber beetle and corn rootworm beetle, seems to me that you should be able to produce resistance to a number of other insects as well, because those are some of the most difficult. So without having specific experience, I would say that it's my expectation that we can, yes. I don't know exactly how right now.
We could all be certified organic?
It's possible, if you chose to.
That's the question as far as the first year. When do you kind of lay off of any kind of
So
program?
when we first start working with a farm, many of the farms that we start working with have heard about us from other farmers. They've seen the quality results of much higher quality fruit. Actually, that is one piece that I completely missed discussing today, this afternoon. And they've observed the results in terms of improved disease and insect resistance, and they want those results on their own farm as well. When we first start working with a farm, we do not recommend that they discontinue or even slow down or reduce their fungicide and insecticide applications in any way at all. We tend to work with very high value crops that are worth a lot of money, and we do not want to screw things up. So to begin with, we will first do an evaluation of where is this farm now, and we'll start working with sap analysis. We'll start working with nutrient applications and adjusting nutrient applications. And over the course of the first 6 to 8 months, we will see how those plants respond. Some varieties, some plants, some soil types will respond very, very quickly, and farmers will quickly be able to see that their disease pressure is much less than what it has been. In other instances, it might take a year and a half, or sometimes even longer. But we tell the farmers and the customers that we work with that they have to earn the right to reduce insecticide and fungicide applications. If they can consistently, once they see that they no longer have the problems and they want to start cutting back and trying to see how much they really need, then that's something that they're going to have to be comfortable with for themselves as well. So as an example of that, we first started, and I'm using the cherries in Oregon frequently as an example, and they're a really great example. But when we first started working with this one orchard, they gave us a 50-acre trial block for foliar applications only. They said, we're not going to do any soil applications. We've got our soil program figured out. We're happy where we are. We're going to give you 50 acres of foliars on different varieties, different rootstocks, different soil types to play around with. And so over this last 3-year period, that they committed to running a 3-year trial because they didn't honestly expect to see any results the first year. So what happened, it's kind of a funny story, but what happened is that the first year we produced such a substantial size and firmness difference that they took half a dozen of the recommendations that we made and the products that we were using and started implementing them across the entire remaining part of the orchard. So now we were, in essence, almost competing with ourselves for the treated control. But then what happened is we continued working with the foliars on this 50-acre block, and all of a sudden, the second year that we worked with them, they noticed that they had no powdery mildew on the Regina. And the Regina are a fairly powdery mildew resistant variety, so it wasn't any extraordinary surprise. So the following year, they completely stopped all fungicide applications on Regina. And then they had a neighboring block of Sweethearts, and the Sweethearts are extremely powdery mildew susceptible. If there is powdery mildew anywhere in the neighborhood, they will be the first to get it. So because of their experience on the Regina, they sprayed half the block, and the other half of the block, they sprayed the Sweetheart block. They only sprayed, they put on 4 fungicide applications over the course of the year instead of 7. They only did every other one, and they ended up putting on 4 instead of 7 with the others. We had a field day there in July at harvest, and we had 50 experienced cherry growers and field men and agronomists that attended that field day. And Mike told all the people that were present that he will give them a $5 voucher to AEA if they can find any powdery mildew in that block. They searched aggressively to find powdery mildew, and they eventually ended up finding 2 leaves with small spots of powdery mildew that was mostly dead. It was not even an active infection. So they were able to find those results. So Mike now, this next year, is expecting to continue. First of all, he's expanding that 3-year trial that we did on that 50-acre block to the entire rest of the orchard. And he's expecting to continue reducing his fungicide applications over the course of the next several years to, I expect, I would say probably it's very possible that in a 3 to 4 year time frame, he may be putting on no fungicide applications for powdery mildew across his entire orchard. So it can be done, yes.
Does he use the same program on different varieties?
He did initially, but we are starting to customize it to be variety specific because there are some substantial differences in some of the different varieties. Yes?
You said that they were satisfied with their soil application of fertilizers.
Yep.
Has that changed over time?
Yes, they're doing an amazing job with soil, with compost applications, with mulch applications. I mean, they have an earthworm population the likes of which you have never seen ever before anywhere else other than in a vermicomposting bin. So they have a tremendous earthworm population. They're doing amazing things with their soil. But we have started working with soil applications as well because they had one 7-acre block of cherry trees that they were intending to dose out. They had herbicide residue of matrix. A matrix application had been made about 5 years earlier, and that specific variety rootstock combination did not like the matrix, and it just never fully recovered. So we ended up applying a microbial inoculant that was specifically known to bioremediate hydrocarbons, and completely remediated that herbicide. The trees snapped back out of it. We did some other additional soil work, and because of the response that we got with the soil work that we did on that block, we're now working with soils throughout the rest of the orchard as well.
So then, these test results, we still, it seems like we still take a soil test and still do remediation based on the soil test. But then
Here's the difference. One of my major frustrations in the consulting work that we do is having to clean up after agronomists who work very hard to make a pretty looking soil test. I couldn't care less about producing a pretty piece of paper. It's not about producing an ideally balanced soil analysis. It's about producing a really healthy crop. And the crop itself, the plant itself, is the final report card. It's the final report card of what actually happened and what's actually going on. I don't care whether the soil is perfectly balanced or not, as long as we can produce a really healthy crop. And so the sap analysis, we use the sap analysis as our guiding tool to manage the plant during the growing season, and also to manage nutrient supply and dry nutrient applications from season to season. We do still use soil analysis. We use soil analysis and we make recommendations for soil amendments based on soil analysis, but we care more about the plant than we do about the soil. Because there is this general ideology and understanding that it takes healthy soil to produce healthy plants. Everybody knows that. Everybody talks about it. It takes healthy soil to grow healthy crops. And yet, what I described for you earlier when I was talking about the corn example of building soil organic matter by building a healthy crop, what we're describing is that extraordinarily healthy crops produce healthy soil and create healthy soil. So there are two different ways of when we talk about developing regenerative agricultural systems, there are two different ways of building and developing these systems. One is that you can import a lot of amendments that are usually very expensive in the form of compost and soil amendments and so forth. You can try to rebuild soil health. You can add microbial inoculants, and those are all really good things, and they cost a lot of money, and they take time. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5 years to really regenerate soil, and sometimes longer depending on where you are when you begin. Whereas with crops, you have this little magic system called photosynthesis that allows you to put on a foliar spray of 6 quarts per acre and produce 600 pounds more sugar per day than you were before you put on those 6 quarts of nutrients. You have this little machine where you can put in a very small trigger and you get a much bigger response than what you put on. You cannot afford to put on enough compost or enough soil amendments to match what a photosynthesis engine can do. Plants have the potential to exponentially accelerate soil development faster than anything else that we can do. So from my perspective, in the work that we do in working with crop management, foliar sprays are the shortcut to success. They are the trigger point at which you can trigger and hack the entire system and get everything to flow much more faster and much more readily. I'm not discounting soil amendments. We use them. They're very valuable. They're needed. But they do not produce the large, immediate, rapid results that foliar applications do. Eric, you had a question earlier.
Originally, my question was going to be on the rehabilitation of Olmec's bad block there, but in talking about taking advantage of photosynthesis, we're also exploring the use of cover crops as just targeting the biological life in the soil and making an affordable or a economical sort of treatment to the soil based on biological activity and plant life.
Our most successful farmers that we're working with today are using their cover crops and considering their cover crops, that they're managing their cover crops as intensely, if not even more intensely, than the crops that they're growing. So one of the farms that we work with is a very intense fruit and vegetable operation in Sandusky, Ohio. that has very sandy soils, as in white beach sand sandy soils, when we first started working with them. And over a 3-year period, they've been doing very aggressive cover cropping for decades. But in spite of that, their organic matter levels have not been increasing because they're very sandy soils. It oxidizes very quickly. They've not really been building any organic matter. When we first started working with them 3 years ago, they continued with their cover crops that they had already been using, but we started foliar feeding their cover crops as intensely as we foliar fed their regular crops. In the last 3 years, they have gained 2 percentage points in organic matter. And their soil today is still as sandy as it ever was, but it's black instead of white. The difference was by foliar feeding these cover crops, we switched all of the root exudates, I shouldn't say all the root exudates, but we switched the root exudate profile to be predominantly sugars, to include sugars and lipids, fats and oils. Now we triggered the formation of stable humic substances, and now we were able to build soil organic matter. So, yes?
Have you been able to verify any reduction in the effects of herbicide drift?
So the question was, have we been able to verify the reduction of any herbicide drift? Yes. Even above and beyond that, we have farmers that will put on foliar applications of some of our materials directly behind a Roundup spray because they know that putting it on 3 days after a Roundup application is going to mitigate the negative effects of the Roundup on the crop they sprayed it on. So they're deliberately using it for that purpose. Yep. All right, so I think it's time to switch gears for a bit. On these sap analysis samples, I'd like, Rob, if you could, for you to talk about your experience with the corn production. And then after that, we'll take a break and we'll come back and talk about how to make recommendations after Rob talks about his experience.
Okay, this front sample we're going to go over. This is some corn I was working on, and a lot of the research I've done and everything is making a foliar application after R1, R2, just to see how much we could pump up that kernel, increase that kernel size, and ultimately affect our yield. And so as we was getting ready to do this, I'd already put an application of our system VT on right before tassel. And just visually looking at the corn, I strongly suspected we had a magnesium deficiency in it. So the corn stage was right between R2 and R3. This corn had been hailed twice throughout the year, so we'd already been off to a rough start. So it wasn't exactly even. But we come in and flew it on at, between R2 and R3. And then I pulled these samples 3 days after we flew that on, just to see how fast we could get a response from it. And what I put on was 1 pint of our system magnesium and 1 pint of our Vigor C-Cal. And so if we'll go through that, the one thing that John might want to comment, where we put this on later on at like R3, we never really moved the sugars. They're both at 0.8. But as we go down through the calcium and the magnesium and all that, you'll see some great improvements there. Let's start out with the calcium. We were 2070 on the new growth on the treated and 1160 on the untreated. So there again, we were just putting on 1 pint of the Vigor C-Cal, and we got that type of a response out of it. The magnesium, 699 versus 381. And what I use this for is when we sell our phosphites, we talk so much about a root flush, pulling these nutrients up, getting those nutrients that are tied up in the soil, getting them into the grain. So this is probably one of the better examples I've ever seen about how effective that root flush is. The sodium is really interesting. You'll look at that. We're extremely high on sodium on both of them. What we were doing, we were using This was it was a used center pivot that we put up there, and I'll be blunt with you, we got it running, and I just never wanted to shut it off. So it's very, very sandy ground. I just set it on about 4/10, and we just let it run. And you know, with a traditional soil or a traditional leaf sample, we never ever picked this up that we had sodium issues. And with this here, it shows up that we actually do. So let's compare the ammonium. 285 versus 239 was basically the same. Nitrate, we were actually higher on the treated. It's dropped down to the total N, 787 versus 704, so we were basically the same. And we had put 25 units of N through the pivot about a week earlier, so we'd expect that. Chlorides, the treated was a little higher, 365 versus 228. Sulfur, 281 versus 259. Phosphorus, 736 versus 564. That may not seem like a big increase, but if you figure the time of the season, how late in the year we were, and how hard it is to pull, that shows you that the combination of the Vigor C-Cal and the phosphite, we really did pull that phosphorus out of there, and it was quite impressive that we could move the needle that far. Silica 77, basically the same. One thing's interesting on the iron, we're actually a little lower on the treated, 162 versus 2.75. John, would you say at that time that lower iron is costing us yield?
Yes.
Okay.
Without question.
Yep. Manganese, another interesting one, 47.5 versus 21.40. This field, the last several years, I traditionally fought a manganese shortage on this, and this year I just said, heck with it. I put on 2 pounds of manganese sulfate when we did our broadcast fertilizer. And so there again, that root flush is showing you that with that root flush, we pulled that manganese up, and a huge difference. Almost, well, a little over double. So zinc 3.49 versus 2.99, not a big difference. Boron 11.6 versus 8.81. Somebody was talking earlier about boron, if it's used on corn. I foliar feed calcium and boron all the time, just small amounts. Unless we got a herbicide in there, always put a minute amount of calcium and boron in there. Corn grows so fast that it'll outgrow it. So. The copper, I can't explain that one. I don't know what's going on there, but that's a huge difference. And then, of course, the moly. One thing I will add, John talked about converting nitrates with the molybdenum and sulfur. When we was doing the research trying to figure out the current formula of the System Advance right now, that's one thing we noticed real quick, is anytime we had moly in that foliar spray, our nitrates were 1/3 to 1/2 of the untreated check. So, and Larry and I have seen that for several years. If you got moly in there, you can cut those nitrates down. But that's all I have on here.
What was the result?
We don't know exactly, but the treated was at least 283 bushel. Now, I say it's at least that because they weighed the semi-load off, and there was still some in the grain cart, and then somehow the grain cart didn't get weighed or whatever. We pulled this a little early. The feedlot needed some corn, so they said they'd take a load. The test weight on this was like 60.9 pounds at 18 moisture. And those kernels were just huge. You could just not even barely see the dent in there. And so it was about a week later when we came back, and they were supposed to weigh the untreated check. They didn't get that done. I rode in the combine, and the monitor never ever went over 225. So quite a story there. So obviously we're going to look at that.
Did you lessen your fertilizer cost or increase it?
You know, it's a tough deal because we'd been hailed twice, and you know, I don't know that we lessened it that much, but my theory is every time you get hailed, it costs you 40 pounds of N. So, meaning that it takes you that much to get back to where you were.
I just got done 15 minutes ago saying that foliar sprays are the shortcut to success and they're the way to hack the entire system, and this is a really, really good example of that. So I'm not familiar with the concept that you guys are referring to as root flush, but if it is what I expect it is that you're referring to, whenever you put on a foliar spray and you increase the plant's photosynthetic rate, you're going to flush a lot of sugars as root exudates out to the root system, which is going to drive biology and stimulate biology, which is going to increase the availability of minerals from the soil profile. And that is what I would expect is happening here. So I'm not familiar with the products that you applied, Rob, but if I'm understanding it correctly, then you didn't actually apply any manganese or copper or any of those elements in that foliar spray.
No, it was calcium and magnesium.
That's it?
With some seaweed.
Okay, so with a small amount of seaweed application, which doesn't contain any of these trace minerals in any appreciable quantities.
No.
So the effect that we're seeing here is that when we send these sugars out through the root system, you get this very aggressive microbial stimulation. And that microbial stimulation is what is responsible for extracting the manganese and the copper and these various other minerals. And I am very, very impressed with the phosphorus response. This increasing phosphorus by 200 parts per million is a big deal. It's a really big deal. It's not something that usually, this is the equivalent of putting on 100 pounds of MAP per acre. It's not something that usually happens from a very slight phosphorus application. So when we look at these samples, just as a very quick overview, for those of you that have not seen these samples before, the bar graphs on the right are divided vertically into 3 columns. And the center column is what is defined as the median range. This is where they know that crops seem to perform, based on a lot of lab data, they know that the crops in this range seem to perform reasonably well. And crops above the median range tend to sometimes have toxicity symptoms in some situations, but not at all. The reality is that even these bar graphs, while very helpful and useful interpreting results, are not, in my opinion, the end-all and be-all. They're a useful guide, but they are still only a representation of an average crop. And quite frankly, I don't care about growing an average crop. That's not why I started doing consulting work. I want to grow exceptional crops. I want to grow extraordinary crops. And sometimes it takes different nutritional profiles to accomplish those results. All right, so now we come to the really fun part of the day. This is the test. So, for this next part of the discussion, I would like for you, I'm trying to figure out which test I'm going to select. I would like for you to take the third test that is in your handout. The sample date at the top is 22/6/2015. This is the European sample. So this would European representations would actually be June 22nd. Jewel strawberries. You guys see it? You got it? All right. So what we'd like to do is to divide up per table in groups of 3 or in groups of 4. And I'd like for you to go through this SAP analysis report and just review very quickly the nutrients which are excessive, which are deficient, and what recommendations you would make for a farmer to apply on this crop. Just in terms of ranges, low, medium, and high. You don't have to put on specific application rates unless you want to, if you're familiar with some of the Agro K products and want to do it in that way. You'd like to see us go through with an example first? Okay. It's a really good input. So, Jewel strawberries, dated 6/22. This should be the third piece of paper. Or fourth? Got it. Sorry about that. Okay, so what I will do is I'll go through this first example. I'm just going to give you kind of a running summary. I obviously have not done my homework in advance because I didn't see this test until 3 minutes ago. So I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of this SAP report and some of the things that I'm looking at, what my thoughts are, and what types of recommendations that I would make. So if we start at the top, the first thing that we see is we have a total sugar content. We have 3.5% in the new leaves at the top part of the plant, and we have 5% in the old leaves at the bottom of the plant. They're showing this as an indicator that this plant, that this is on the lower side of the range of where they like to see sugar levels. And I don't know, I'm not intimately familiar with this crop. This is a sample that Eric put together for us. I'm not sure exactly what the agronomic conditions were, but I'm not terribly concerned about this low sugar level. Depending on which stage they are at the 22nd of June, they're probably, I would guess, they're probably approaching the end of harvest. Would that be about correct? That's correct. So they've probably just spent a lot of their sugars and transferred a lot of sugars to the fruit. So I'm not too terribly concerned about that sugar number. pH number is slightly on the acidic side, which means that we'll probably discover we have low levels of some of the cations. EC levels are in the desired range. Nothing really to comment on there. If we look at potassium, we have 5,290 on the new leaves and 5,410 on the old. So this is an indicator for us that this plant has a generous amount of potassium, because it has 200 parts per million higher in the old leaves than it was in the new. So if this ratio were inverted, if we had 5,400 in the top and 5,200 in the bottom, I'd be pretty concerned about that. Well, actually, I'd not be concerned about it at this stage because we're already past the harvest stage. But to have these levels of potassium at the tail end of harvest means my expectation would be that we would have had very good berry size all the way through harvest, because we had generous levels of potassium to fill that fruit all the way through. If we look at the calcium levels, we have calcium at 575 on the new leaves and 764 in the old. And again, the calcium is trending low here. It is slightly lower in the new growth, and it's also not quite where the desired ranges should be. And so it would be my expectation that this low calcium level is what is contributing to the slightly acidic pH. If we had slightly higher calcium, our pH would likely be a little bit higher. And also because the calcium is trending low, there's a very good possibility, a probability I would even say, that the latter 3 to 4 pickings of fruit, possibly more, might have had softer berries, might not have had the berry firmness because calcium levels were starting to drop off. Then if we look at magnesium levels are 650 on both the old and the new. It's very unusual to see them be this close. And so if I have something that is this similar, I would pay some attention to the bar graphs, and I would put on, I would make some recommendations for a magnesium application here, just to see how the plants respond. I'd like to put on a magnesium and see where it goes and where it moves into in the plant, whether it goes into the old leaves or whether it goes into the new. Sodium levels are very low, which is a good thing. If we look at ammonium, we have 111.
I'm sorry. So would you make that application and then quickly take a sample? Like
I would take
4
another.
hours?
No, I would take another sample 2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. Okay.
Yep. If we look at the ammonium levels, we have 111, 122 parts per million of ammonium. Now, I know from experience that the healthiest plants should have no ammonium, and it's our goal to have no ammonium. We want all that ammonium to be converted. So the question is, why do we have higher ammonium levels at this stage? It's the 22nd of June. The conversation that we had about photorespiration is not appropriate at this point. It's not that warm at this time of the growing season, not usually anyway. And so where is this ammonium coming from? This ammonium is coming from the fact that these plants are already beginning to senesce. We have, at this late stage of harvest, we've already triggered senescence. And senescence is one of those the physiological processes that I noted on the slide about ammonium, that when you start senescence, some of the proteins will begin converting to ammonium in the leaf as well. So because of that factor, and because we're at the tail end of harvest, these plants are going to be renovated sometime in the next couple of weeks. I'm not too concerned about this ammonium level. Actually, let me go back up just a bit and make a comment on calcium. For strawberries, strawberry bud initiation happens in fall and early winter, and throughout the winter months for that matter, whenever we have the appropriate conditions. In order to have generous levels of calcium in the berries and form large berries and have high quality berries the following spring, we have to get high concentrations of calcium into the crown in the fall. You cannot supply adequate amounts of calcium in the spring if you have a calcium shortage. You can put on all the calcium you can possibly imagine and you will still not be able to produce very large sized. Yesterday we talked about berry size being and fruit size being directly correlated to the amount of cell division during the bud initiation in the embryo stage. Strawberries are an outlier. They're an exception here because in strawberries, you're not actually forming strawberries are a drupe. You're not forming a fruit in the conventional sense. And what that means is that, in a practical sense, is that the cells that are forming that strawberry are actually developed during the bud initiation stage in the fall, not in the spring. So you need to have very strong calcium supplies in the crown in the fall in order to build really large berries the following spring. Okay, jumping back to the analysis, looking at this, if we look at the total nitrate numbers, nitrate is essentially a non-detect. They couldn't find any at all. If you look at total nitrogen, the numbers here are 142 and 194 parts per million. They do not put a bar graph on nitrogen on strawberries because of the huge variability factor that I mentioned earlier this afternoon. They find that some varieties require levels of 400 or 500 parts per million and others 1900 parts per million. So they don't have a desired range for nitrogen on strawberries. Based on the experience that I would have, the lowest varieties that I know of will have nitrogen requirements somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 parts per million. So when we look at this specific analysis and we see these low numbers, obviously the nitrogen level here is lower than what it should be. And again, it would be my expectation that is happening because these plants are senescing. They're already in decline, they are completely mature, and these leaves are losing their nutritional integrity. If we look at the chloride levels, we have chloride levels are low, which is good. I'm happy to see that. Sulfur levels 120 and 96 on the upper range of the median. No adjustments need to be made there. Phosphorus levels are at 998 and 1009, and it would be common, I'm very impressed with this sample actually, it would be common for strawberries at this stage of senescence to begin losing phosphorus and not have such high levels of phosphorus. So this is really good. Silica levels are on the lower side of the spectrum, and this is not really a surprise, partially because the root system is going into decline as these plants go into senescence as well. On Iron levels are low, and definitely iron needs to be corrected. Manganese is, this bar graph shows manganese as being adequate. I don't believe it. I'm such a strong fan of manganese that I would put on additional manganese applications because I know the impact that it has on disease control and overall plant health. Definitely zinc needs to be addressed. Boron needs to be addressed. I would be careful with boron because strawberries are very boron sensitive. And then copper needs to be addressed as well. They do not have a bar graph for molybdenum, but I would say that it looks like molybdenum levels are adequate, and I would expect that they've been applying products with molybdenum to get this molybdenum level up to this point. So now the question becomes, what would I recommend? What would my recommendations be based on this overview? I'm going to make would it be a safe assumption to say that this crop is going to be renovated in the next week to 2 weeks, and then we're going to be managing it after that renovation? So if that were the case, let's say, for the sake of discussion, that this sap analysis sample was pulled and the crop was renovated in the next 2 to 3 days after, and we then wanted to, 10 days later, we start having some additional regrowth, and we want to put on a foliar application, and then we're going to take another sap analysis shortly after that foliar application. So in this case, based on what this report is telling me, I would say that these plants have, last fall, they did not have an adequate supply of calcium in the crown. And that is very likely to also be a challenge this next fall. So I want to do everything that I can over the course of the next several months to make certain that we have a generous supply of calcium in the crown this coming fall. And that is, I will do two things. One is, depending on what's happening in the soil, which I don't have the context for, but I may make recommendations for a soil application of calcium, dry calcium application, gypsum, Fertical, or whatever might be appropriate. Calcium nitrate, could be a number of different things. Secondly, I would make certain that we're supplying adequate levels of calcium in the irrigation system, and I would also address calcium in the foliar. In particular, during late fall, just as the plants start going into dormancy, I would put on probably 2 very aggressive foliar applications of calcium to get that calcium in high concentrations to move into the crown. Because of the potassium levels here, I would not be concerned about addressing potassium in the foliar. We don't have any reproduction happening for the remainder of the season, so I would not include potassium in the foliar. I would include magnesium in the foliar, as I mentioned earlier, and I don't have enough information right now to make a nitrogen recommendation because I don't believe this data. I know these plants are going into senescence, and I don't think this is an accurate representative of where this crop actually is. So I would probably wait until after I took that follow-up SAP analysis to make any adjustments on nitrogen. If we look at the sulfur is adequate, phosphorus is adequate, would not make any changes and adjustments on phosphorus. When we look at silicon, the silicon levels are actually quite low, silicon is one of those very few elements that I don't think you can overdo, because there isn't really a toxicity point for silicon. There are no negative side effects to having really high concentrations of silicon, and plants also tend to auto-regulate it very well. So strawberries have a very interesting root system. They have, compared to other annual or perennial plants, they have some very interesting associations with mycorrhizal fungi and other fungi. So one of the things that I would consider is during the renovation or shortly after the renovation would be applying a microbial inoculant like a mycorrhizal fungi and a very strong, very aggressive microbial biostimulant to really stimulate and charge that root system. And I would expect to see a silicon response from that microbial stimulation. I'm very concerned about the iron, the manganese, the zinc, and the copper levels. All of those metals are low, which leads me to believe that there's a very strong probability that we have an oxidized soil environment with very low levels of these metals being available. So obviously the microbial stimulation plays a part in this, but I would also begin including all of those trace minerals in the irrigation system and in foliar sprays from now throughout the fall. I would put them into a foliar spray and address those minerals as a foliar, you can get a tremendous amount of bud initiation and bud set in the fall if you have generous levels of those different trace minerals. So the trace minerals right now are a major, major concern for me. I'm really concerned about where those are. Boron, I would consider addressing boron, but I would be very, very, very careful because strawberries are super sensitive to boron and they accumulate toxicity symptoms very quickly. So, yes.
You know, regular boron applications are a regular thing in strawberries. When you say there's sensitivity,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 1 to 2 pounds of boron annually is general practice.
Really?
Do you feel that's incorrect?
Based on my experience, I would say so. And you say 1 to 2 pounds of boron. Are you talking dry boron applications?
Yeah, actual boron.
Dry, but broadcast dry.
Could be between that and a foliar.
Okay.
A lot of growers will put with their fungicides during bloom, will put in a pioneer or boric acid for acre 2.
Well, there is no rule about nutrition management or anything else in agriculture that has not been successfully broken by someone, somewhere, sometime. That's very true. However, so I'm open to the possibility. I just know from experience that on a number of different operations, we have applied boron onto strawberries and had very, very negative effects. And this was from boron applications as a foliar at a rate of, we were putting on foliar applications at 2 quarts of a 0.2% boron. So very, very small quantities. Boron was just one part of an entire combination in this one product that we were putting on. And we had a very negative response to that boron application. And we've seen that repeatedly now. Is the question, is that particular boron that we were using very bioactive? Or is there some other effect that's going on? Yes, Del?
We would generally use a combination of calcium and boron.
Yeah,
Calcium and 0.5% boron.
we would use the same. Or we would, in all of our boron applications, foliar include calcium. It's always put on in a combination. So, yeah. So there, I'm open to input. I can always learn something new. I'd be interested in exploring that more. Yes.
John, one of the things you talked about was the antagonistic effect of some of these different nutrients. And I thought one of them was potassium and calcium. With high potassium, can you expect lower calcium? Are they conflicting with each other?
Very good observation. I was wondering who was going to pick that up. So the question was, and there's a second one in here as well. So the question was, can we expect to have higher calcium levels with the high potassium levels that we have here right now? And I'm familiar with this strawberry variety, but not with this specific soil and what is happening here. But I would expect that in order to get calcium up into the crown, I would not put on any additional potassium from now until fall. I would wait for any potassium applications until the following spring at fruit fill. I would shut off all the potassium unless we saw with later sap analysis that the potassium levels were starting to drop down again. Yep.
And at that time of the year, there's often a bit of a deterioration in the root system, so your calcium uptake is
That's also true. Yep. Good point, Del. Yes.
Sodium, am I correct? We had talked about sodium would increase food firmness, and you said this low level was desirable.
Yep. So both sodium and chloride can contribute to fruit firmness, and we have some chloride in the system here. Strawberries are they're one of a very few crops that I put in this category of, I don't think anybody anywhere really knows how to manage them quite yet. And the reason I say that is because every time we come up with a specific guideline, just as the boron case, then we've discovered that someone is successfully violating it. And so with strawberries, strawberries have a root system, and I mentioned earlier they have a unique root system. And what I meant by that is their rhizosphere microbial community is completely different from almost any other of our domesticated crops. It's very different from raspberries, blueberries. Really, there is no rhizosphere community that is similar to the community of strawberries. And so it's been our observation that any generous levels of sodium will suppress that rhizosphere community, and that's what I'm trying to mitigate. So that's why I'm happy to see the low sodium levels for this specific crop. This crop is a bit of an anomaly. It maybe wasn't the best crop to pick from a first example, or maybe it was. Yes?
John, what jumps out at me is, you said that a good pH for that sap is about 6.4.
Correct.
All right, there's lots of indicators here that the soil has probably got a low level of calcium. Probably needs a lime application, in my view. With calcium low, the pH in the plant soil, and on. So, do you not, tell me how you feel about that.
We see zero correlation between sap analysis and soil analysis. So to the point that Dell made earlier, what is happening here is these plants are beginning to senesce, and so that means that the root system is also going into decline. Because that root system is going into decline, it is picking up lower levels of calcium. So in fact, you could have very high calcium content soil and yet still have this phenomena with calcium happening.
pH of the sap, help me with that.
No, there's no correlation between sap pH and soil pH at all. I actually suspect that this soil is either very oxidized or calcareous. And the reason I suspect this is a calcareous soil is because all of the metals, iron and manganese and zinc and copper, are all on the low side of the spectrum, which happens in calcareous soil. So it's either calcareous or it's very oxidized. It's one of those two. Now, there is another antagonistic relationship that is happening here as well. When you look at this, zinc is particularly low. I mean, zinc and iron are both very low. And we also have generous levels, not a surplus, but we have generous levels of phosphorus. And I would suspect that that phosphorus supply is possibly also potentially reducing zinc uptake a little bit. But particularly because also the root system is likely going into decline, and probably if we'd taken this test 4 weeks earlier, our phosphorus levels should have been much higher and the zinc levels even lower. And we have an earlier test, and I am incorrect.
That was right during harvest. They were probably applying potassium, foliar, and calcium. May have put some in N on as well. Kind of reinforce the energy levels.
Yep. All right, so let's flip the page